Happy Friday, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest for this live Q&A session. Joël, a very well welcome to the live stream today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Silvan. Thanks for having me.
You're the CEO and founder at Real Growth Hacking. And before you actually started your own company, you worked at Beekeeper for 4 years as a growth manager and then as a head of growth. And to start off with the first question, I wonder what actually motivated you to start a growth hacking accelerator as opposed to any other sort of venture that you could have started after, having a career at Beekeeper?
Yeah, that's a good question I get often. I would say the true answer for that is there was no actual motivation behind that, right? So story goes, I was a beekeeper. I knew I wanted to do my own thing again at some point. I planned to take kind of like a year off to give me some space, learn about new technologies, new businesses. But as I stopped at Beekeeper, opening doors for other stuff, there were just so many questions coming up from startups, like how have you done this? How have you done that? And I kind of found myself suddenly supporting different people, supporting different startups. And then basically just started, I did an experiment myself. I just posted on LinkedIn that I'm doing like free growth hacking coaching calls, like 30-minute, like no strings attached, just providing value. And that completely hit like a bump. I got within like
Wow.
3 days or 30 different calls, and they were all asking me, hey, how to continue from there. I did not have an answer. A VC came, asked if I can support startups, and one thing led to the other.
So that was basically your validation process. You saw that there's a huge demand out there. I also wonder, you've been at the fast-paced and rapidly growing startup Beekeeper. How do you also notice the difference between being at the rapidly growing company and launching your own initiative from scratch? I mean, that's probably quite a different setup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely like a different setup and also new experiences and learnings for me on the go, right? I would say, luckily, the value I provide to clients is working with frameworks, working with structures, and step-by-step processes to get from A to B. And of course, I apply that to myself as well. So starting this business already there, I like kind of follow the process of, validating each single step on a qualitative level, then on a quantitative level, and then going from there. So there are definitely certain frameworks that I could take over from my past experience and apply this while building this company. But a lot of it is definitely also new, where I do mistakes, and I have done mistakes, absolutely.
That's part of the game. But hey, today
Indeed.
we want to talk about growth hacking, right? So also for anybody listening or watching to this, you can ask your questions in the comments. So just post a comment on the stream and we might be able to actually address that in this live stream today. So let's start with the very basics, Joel. What is growth hacking and what is it not?
Good question. So the sad thing about growth hacking is that so many people like understand something like differently about this term, right? In its essence, growth hacking was coined by Sean Ellis. He's kind of like the godfather of growth hacking, and basically it's an umbrella term for all kind of strategies that are focused on growth. Okay, so when you perform growth hacking, there's three different things you do. First of all, you want to measure what's going on in your business. Okay, so you need to make sure that you can measure the stuff. Framework coming with this is the so-called Pirate Funnel from Dave McClure. It's a very nice framework to actually understand what is going on in your business and what is driving growth. Next step is that you want to identify what your true growth levers are. So you want to analyze this data, and by doing this, you really understand, what kind of channel is it that drives most traffic, most leads, most marketing qualified leads, whatever it is, right? Where do I have conversion drops? And that really helps you to then decide as a startup, where do I invest the limited resources I have to get the biggest bang for the buck? Okay. And then the third thing is actually creating impact. And this is done by experimentation. So growth hacking is all about experimentation with like the understanding that we cannot trust our gut feeling, but we actually need to experiment and test with our users with different channels to make sure to move those KPIs forward. So in essence, growth hacking is the mixture between data analytics, marketing, and engineering and automation, because you're always looking for scalable ways to grow a business.
Yeah, that's quite a cross-functional setup. Before we dive a bit deeper into these different topics that you just mentioned, I also wonder about the ideal starting point. Is there any such thing? Like, when should a startup start thinking about growth hacking? And is there such a thing as thinking or doing that too early on?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So I mean, in the core, growth hacking is something for scaling. Those tactics you start applying if you want to scale your business, right? That means growth hacking, the right time to start with it is when you enter scaling phase with your company. That means you identified product market fit, and now you're really ready to scale up your channels, right? However, even though when you're in product market fit stage, right, let's say you left the conceptual phase, you have it validated on a qualitative level, you go into quantitative validation, where you spin up first at landing pages, you start first demand tests, right, to send ads and traffic and measure what's going on. I mean, already there, the mindset of growth hacking and a strong focus on tracking what's going on, this is already happening. You're basically
Hmm.
already conducting experiments, right? An important thing is that we actually track it in detail, because if you don't do this,
Yeah,
you never reach product market fit and the business is going to fail.
right. That's maybe also a good point to continue with. To fail or to scale, sometimes that's a very small, a thin balance that you have to strike there. So why do companies actually miss product market fit from your experience? What goes wrong there, and how can you avoid that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely one big reason why companies fail in that stage is because they don't follow a proper process, right? They fall in love with the solution, or they even think about the solution before they actually validated the problem, right?
Hmm.
But if you build a business and you follow a proper step-by-step process, you first of all start with the market, understanding how big is the market and how attractive is it. Do I ever want to build a solution in this market, right? It's the first thing you need to do. Next, you need to identify the underserved needs. That's done in a qualitative level. And there again, focus on the problems first before any solutions, validate it through user interviews, validate a potential solution, and then you go into the quantitative validation, right? This is really the business building process. And at some point, if you follow that, you're going to end up with an MVP, with some sort of a product which you're going to deploy to your first users and customers, right? And then you really need to start tracking usage. And they're basically two frameworks which you can use to track product market fit when you have a product. Okay,
Hmm.
it's not a perfect solution. You cannot say then you have it or you don't have it, but it's it's a good tool, or it's good tools that support you on this track. And the first one is the so-called product market fit survey by Sean Ellis. So that's a qualitative framework on how you can measure product market fit. Basically, you send a survey to all your users asking, hey, how disappointed would you be if you could no longer use the tool tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And because this survey has been conducted several thousand of times by different companies, you know from benchmark data that if around 40% tell you, hey, I would be very disappointed, that's a clear sign of a product market fit, right?
Hmm.
The value is not just that you can measure this metric, but also by analyzing the survey, you will learn what are actually the different items you need to improve in your product to increase the score. It's very important,
Yeah.
right? On the other hand, you have the quantitative framework, which is retention analysis, right? So when you have like a business where you have a lot of users or a lot of customers and you can already measure retention in that way, that's definitely the ultimate proof that you have product market fit. And what you're looking out there is that you can see a retention chart which has a hockey stick, meaning it can drop in the beginning quite steep, but it needs to flatten out. So
Hmm.
when your retention curve flattens out, that's a strong sign for product market fit, right? Those tools are very, very handy and are recommended to any kind of startup. If you don't use that in your product market fit stage, you definitely should do this. There are
Yeah.
exceptions, right? Let's say if you're like a B2B enterprise company, very hard to apply the quantitative framework because you have very limited data. But nevertheless, then maybe you take a look at the users in those companies that are using your product to
Hmm.
get an understanding for do they stick with the product or not.
Right. So we see data is like the real groundwork or the basis of whatever you want to do in growth hacking. So how do you actually start there? Because I can imagine many companies, they focus on sales or on marketing, but they don't have the additional data that you might need to actually build a solid growth hacking framework. So where do you recommend them to start if there's no or very few data available?
Yeah, absolutely good question. So, I mean, the first thing, as I said, in growth hacking is you need to measure, right?
Hmm.
So let's say you have a product out there, you're winning first customers, you need to create your pirate funnel. So that means you need to have like your Google Analytics, your CRM in place to make sure you can track all the different channels you're actually using. So paid channels, non-paid channels, inbound, outbound, and so on. And you need to make sure that you can track them throughout the entire user journey, meaning throughout the entire life cycle a user or a prospect is having with your company. from lead to MQL to SQL to opportunity to customer and so on. And by building this, of course, you realize, okay, where is tracking misplaced, where I need to build tracking. The goal is to arrive at this point, and then you have for first time an understanding for, okay, what works and what does not work. And that's really the baseline you should do. And this is such a valuable insight that this needs to be done in a cross-functional team. Like most of our customers, no matter the size, 10, 15 employee companies, up to 180 people companies, we're always working with C-level, right? Because it's so important.
Mm-hmm. And talking about cross-functional teams, what functions and roles do you actually need to have in there? You briefly mentioned at the beginning, but I just wonder, are there more roles? Please elaborate about the key roles that you need to make growth hacking work.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are different layers to it, right? It's like the strategic layer where you have to make decisions after analyzing the part funnel, and there's
Mm-hmm.
of course the executive layer to it, right? On the strategic layer, you definitely want to have a team in your company which is cross-functional, focused on growth, meaning there you want to have the different department leads in this team that can make decisions. That means you're going to have the marketing lead in there. If you're B2B, you're going to have the sales lead in there, and also the product lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a reminder, most crazy growing companies, the growth is coming from product tactics and not marketing and sales tactics, right? And those three different stakeholders from all kind of departments, they need to have the same shared reality and common understanding for growth and take a look at this and then make the decisions. And then depending on what are the issues you identify in your pilot funnel or the opportunities you want to tackle, then you have different teams that execute on this, right? If it's like top of funnel, it might be marketing, and somewhere mid of the funnel, it can be product or sales, and so on and so forth.
And when you have set that up, how do they then also make sure that they actually collaborate effectively together? Because I know you can hire for all these roles, right? But they somehow still have to work together to build a whole system and make that work.
Yeah.
So do you
So
have regular meetings, or do you have
yeah.
everything in one place in terms of tools? What's your best practice there?
Absolutely. So the important fact is that you really pull the people out together in your company that are already responsible for that. Just hiring new people and adding additional complexity doesn't really help, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
you already have a marketing, a sales, and a product lead, those are the people that should meet up, right? And it's like a cross-functional team. So meaning in organizational structure, they remain in their departments and product, but it's kind of like a cross-functional team.
Mm-hmm.
Call it maybe a swarm or a tribe, whatever you like, right?
Yeah.
That meets up on a bi-weekly basis, I would say, right? Analyzes this data, makes decisions, and then makes sure that people work on this. Of course, you can hire more people, but then I always recommend, like, if possible, hire them into the existing department and just make sure they build bridges and work
Mm-hmm.
cross-functional. In some scenarios, it could be that you develop an entire like growth team on your own, right, to get started with it. But generally speaking, where you want to move is really to have that layer within your company. Like growth hacking is not an additional department usually like marketing or sales is. It's a mentality, it's an approach and how you work, which should be embedded in the entire organization.
Got it. However, at Beekeeper, you were the head of growth, so I guess you also had sort of your own department there, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So in Beekeeper, that was an exact case where we actually decided, hey, let's create a new department, a new team
Mm-hmm.
outside of the existing organization to ensure that resources that are put there are not like, taken away suddenly from other priorities. So we basically split from the existing marketing team and then started to hire our own engineering resources because also the main engineering team was completely focused on roadmap delivery, right?
Right.
And if it would have been integrated there like this, our engineers would be working on the roadmap, which you want to avoid, right?
Right.
So that was the start. And then from there, you want to bring the mentality into the rest of the company and basically take it from there. But ultimately, usually you want to desire like a situation where you have it fully integrated.
And if you have this growth team, no matter whether it's its own department or fully integrated, how do you measure them? How do you measure if it's working what they are doing? Do you have
Yeah.
specific KPIs that you should focus on?
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Again, it's not like an other layer you're gonna
Hmm.
add, but basically what you do is after you learn about the pirate funnel, what works or not, in this pirate funnel, you have the core KPIs of your entire business are in this pirate funnel. right? Because otherwise you would not measure it. It reflects the reality of your business. So
Right.
it's not just important to making growth decisions. What we do is we basically take those learnings from the Pirate funnel, and these learnings become our OKRs, objectives and key results, right? So those are the most important metrics that need to be tackled. So if someone is not familiar with OKRs, it's basically a management framework with which you translate your overall strategy into an operational plan so that every team and employee knows exactly what to work on. So that means out of the findings you have out of the Pirate funnel, the OKRs are derived, and this is the KPIs that people should work on. And
Yeah.
this is the most important thing they should work on, right?
I agree. I think that's a very important key message, right? To take away from this session. It's not something that you just build on top. It has to be fully integrated and pay down to your overall company goals and not have its own separate goals. You really have to align everything to make it work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, we already briefly talked about the tools, right? And one thing I wonder is you mentioned the importance of being able to launch experiments on a constant basis. And I imagine for that, you probably also need either your own dev team that can deploy super fast, or you need to have some tools in place to actually allow you to do that without having the dev team deploy a new version of your app or website or whatsoever on a constant basis. So
Yeah.
how can you get to that level where you can actually launch constant experiments and maybe even have like a best practice case study or something that we can walk through together?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, in the very beginning, if we start working with startups, no matter their size, it's not even about building special tools or applying special tools. First of all, we need to put the basics into place, right?
Right.
And with basics, I mean, like, having their CRM set up correctly, the tracking is in place, the ad channels work, sales process is well defined, sales pipeline and methodologies are in place, all of this. Just by doing that, immense impact is usually created, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, you go into the first experimentation, where it's really like the core teams, the core marketing, product or sales team, they're creating first experiences, first experiments. There's something called the growth hacking process. This is just like a methodology on how you do experimentation. You have basically a simple board, an experiment board, where you move the experiments through the stages, where it's clear how you need to analyze something like this, right? And then from there, if you want to increase velocity with an experimentation, which is very important because the more experiments you run, the more you're going to learn, the faster you're going to grow. Then, of course, you start developing, going more into tools on the marketing side. There are tons of tools which you can use for, A/B testing that make it very easy, right? Or like following users. On the product side, there are also like special tools that help you to conduct A/B tests in the product. If we go way further, let's say we talk about Facebook or Spotify level, those entire products, did those companies revamp their entire product on a technical perspective, that the experience you have from a technical perspective is in the background all divided into different microservices, like mini softwares, mini tools that operate by themselves, so they can basically launch experiments independently to the different experiences of the product, right?
Yeah.
But it's like going way further. But to get started, you just get going and then you start advancing to increase speed.
Yeah, that's like next level growth hacking, what you just
Yeah.
described with Spotify, etc. Do you have a favorite tool stack to get started? Because I know people, they love to get very specific recommendations. So if you had to pick your top 3 or top 5 tools, is there any
Yeah.
tool stack that you say, hey, to get started with growth hacking, that's a very good starting point?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there we have to differentiate between tools that just support your work and then tools you actually use to conduct experiments, right? I
Right.
mean, the tools we work mostly with to also build the foundations, build the tracking is Google Analytics. On the CRM side, usually HubSpot is just the easiest tool to get started, which also delivers tons of value. It's not for free, right? But I mean, it has premium, but the version you need to pay. But it's a really, really good tool that can do a lot, right? So that already helps you a lot. And then on the product side, for product analytics, you have tools like Mixpanel or Amplitude, which are really, really nice tools, right, to analyze all the data and to get a good understanding. To conduct A/B tests on the marketing side, you have free tools like Google Optimize, which you can use. So that's also very cool. And then now, as you would go into, conduct different experiments, then you would have their different tools that are made specifically for that, right?
Right.
Actually, one of the tools I use the most is Trello, just to have an experiment board and move experiments with the clients. Super easy, super handy. Does all the work we need. You don't even need a crazy software to log and track your experiments.
Yeah. Don't over-engineer it, right?
Yes, just get started, create impact. That's the most important.
How does your Trello board look like? Like what different stages do you have there for an experiment to walk through and then eventually also be implemented in the product once it succeeds?
Yeah. So basically, you can in the internet, you find that you can copy existing Trello boards where all the stages are there, right? If you follow the growth hacking process, the stages look like you start with backlog. This is just where everyone dumps their ideas. It's
Hmm.
unstructured, right? Next one then would be pipeline. This is then where you start designing the experiments and you prioritize them. So this is a
Hmm.
prioritized list of what are the next experiments that are coming up. Then you go into design, meaning then you're really fine tuning all what is needed regarding the experiment, the control group, the test group, the collateral you need, whatever it is, right? Implementation is in actually building and launching it. Analyze stage is where you keep the experiment to track it on an ongoing basis. Some of them run a week, some of them run 2 weeks or even longer, right?
Right.
And then from there, you then go into like systemized approach. It's very, very important so that once you conduct an experiment and you had a learning, that you then also make sure that you take this learning and then you apply it to all kind of things in your business, right? To
Yeah.
increase the impact. Then you move it into history and you focus on the stuff which is running.
Great. I also wonder, before you actually start with an experiment, are there certain criteria that you focus on? I imagine for everything that you want to test, you also come in with a hypothesis to then
Exactly.
reevaluate after you've run the experiment, whether it was a success or not.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that's basically the experiment creation process. And it's very important that this is also aligned with what we mentioned before, right?
Hmm.
Because what happens and what also happened to me was like, okay, growth hacking, super cool, let's create experiments. And then we all came together and we brainstorm about all the cool stuff we can do. And we have a bunch of experiments that all impact other kind of like metrics, right? And then at the end you have a chaos and you kind of go in all kind of directions, but not creating big impact. So
Right.
as a business, the process goes, you create the pirate funnel, you update this once a quarter at least, right? Based
Hmm.
on that, we can derive the objectives and key results. We can say, okay, those are the most important key results. This, and this team should impact. And then this team gets the key results, and usually they contribute already to it.
Hmm.
And then in the beginning of the quarter, you're going to do a kickoff session where you take a look at this key result, you pull together all the data you have. The team that owns it sits down, creates all the hypotheses first, aligns on the hypothesis, creates the different experiments, aligns the experiments, and then prioritizes the different experiments depending on impact and effort they will take. And based
Hmm.
on that, the roadmap of the experiments are created.
And how do you then decide if an experiment is like going okay, but it's not a huge success? And then you decide, do I want to change some things and retest that again? Or do I just kill the whole experiment and say it's not working? So it's somewhere in between a success and a failure that is obvious, somewhere in
Yeah.
between. How do you, then make the assessment and decide how you want to move forward with those experiments?
Yeah. So that's a good question, right? Because, at university, we learn about statistic significance, right? If you want to have something statistically significant, you kind of wait half a year for a startup until it happens so that you have enough data, right? So, I mean, if you're at Google, Facebook, and Co., then it happens faster. But as a startup, not in all cases, right? So basically what you do is at the end we always have our brain that supports us to make decisions, but additionally we run the experiments and we collect data, right,
Mhm.
that helps us to understand things better. If we have a case where then the data goes into one direction, but it's not significant yet and it will take too long to make it significant, and we're also unsure about how to decide about it, then you always have the chance to also get qualitative data on this. So you can
Mhm.
add a quick like user test on like user brain or usability hub, right? That gives you qualitative data on this as well. And then at the end, it's your brain, it's the quantitative data, and it's the user research, the qualitative data part with which you then need to formulate the decision, right?
Yeah. I love that part. I think that's a really great addition to then get more clarity, because often the world is not black and white. You're in a gray area. So it's somewhat
Yeah,
working, but it's not perfectly working. Get the qualitative feedback on top of that, and you probably get closer to that. Love that.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now, one other question about the experiments. Usually startups, they have very limited resources, not only money-wise, but also time-wise. Is there a certain limit of experiments that you would recommend? I know heavily depends on the company size and how, like, what kind of experiments you run, but is there a certain thing of running too many experiments at the same time?
I mean, when we go into a velocity of experiments, then it's important that things become way more professional, because it could always be that like experiments conflict with each other if you're like experiencing on a website or
Exactly.
also in the product, right? So that there are things you need to be aware and to take care of. Um, Generally speaking, I mean, most of the companies that are probably also listening to us here, they're rather like, early stage or like, scaling stage, 150 people or a little bit more.
Right.
I mean, at this point, it's really get going, conduct your experiments, track them clean, right? Make sure no experiment conflicts, and run as many as you can,
Hmm.
as long as they're not conflicting, right?
Yeah.
Then if we go bigger, then you start caring about, okay, how can I increase even velocity? But usually it's not the conflicting part the problem, but more the resources available to build all those experiments. If you're a small company, I mean, and you have little data, then you just need to make sure don't track like or don't test things that are obvious, right? If you're small, there are a bunch of things that are just best practices, right? And then you don't need to test it. Like follow best practices. Of course, track it as an experiment to see if it actually proves or not. But you can just by
Hmm.
following best practices, it has a big impact. At some point, you arrive at the point where there are no best practices anymore. There you actually need to start true experimentation, right?
Yeah.
And there it's basically the recommendation: the smaller traffic, the fewer user you have, the more revolutionary the change must be which you are actually trying out, right?
Hmm.
Because if you like really show two different experiences in your product sales process or no marketing, you get way stronger response than if the change is only small, right?
Right.
And this is then how you get to faster learnings.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, that they're always like, there are really great examples that come to mind. Small PDF is one of them in Switzerland. They constantly A/B test on their website. You get new features or completely different websites. I'm always
Yeah,
blown away by the scale and the speed that they run their experiments. It's amazing to see.
absolutely. Yeah.
One more thing, you mentioned the Trello board where you track everything, you move through the different stages. Do you also use something like Google Data Studio or something on top of that to aggregate all the data points from the different tools that you use? Or do you manually copy paste them into the Trello cards with the experiments in them?
Yeah. So it's a good question, right? In the beginning, when you get started, we're just happy when a company can actually build and track the part funnel, right? It's already
Right.
tell you it's a huge achievement if they get at this point, right? Because then they see what's going on, then they see what's reality. And there we work with a Google Sheet
Hmm.
actually, and then once a quarter, once a month, you take 15 minutes, you copy paste the data from Google Analytics and the stuff from your CRM, done, right? Takes not too much time. Um, so that's done manually, right?
Hmm.
Also logging the experiments in Trello, it's also quickly done manually. Does not take too much time.
Yeah.
Especially with the experiments, every experiment is different. You usually drag together this stuff manually. Now, of course, if you're into that and you advance, you have certain tools where you can start combining this data, as you said, with like Data Studio, etc. However, most of those tools are not capable of aggregating, first of all the data from the different sources you need, and then also
Hmm.
displaying them in the way you need it, right? With Beekeeper, we reached a level where, I mean, that became very important because once you have a pirate funnel and you understand what's going on, it becomes very interesting to also segment this data by certain factors, by company size, industry, region, B2C the same, right? Age, gender,
Right.
whatever. So there we actually made the effort of pulling all this data into a data visualization tool called Looker, where I work with the data engineers to basically build that part funnel in there, which then I could like segment by all
Yeah.
those different stuff, which was crazy, the information you win and the stuff you learn, right? But that's some resources you need to invest. So that's why I recommend to most startups until 150 employees and more, hey, just pull together the data manually and then you're good. Do it once a month, once a quarter, and you have the insights. It's not worth
Exactly.
investing 2, 3, 4 weeks of engineering resources to build that right
Yeah,
now.
because you want to learn, right? You want to run
Yeah,
experiments and not build the internal data process. Absolutely.
absolutely.
And I also love that, to demystify that a bit, because many people think, oh, I have to automate everything. It has to run automatically. It has to be scalable. No, it doesn't have to be. You just have to start somewhere. Even if there's manual work involved there, as long as you learn and run the experiments, you're good. Everything else can be figured out as you grow.
Yeah, I would totally support that, right? Especially for a job which is done once a month or once a quarter, right? I mean, if we go into building marketing and sales processes, then from as a growth hacker heart, of course, everything you want to automate as far as possible because you want to build an engine. But for such jobs, no, let's quick and dirty, let's get the information, let's win the insight, let's go.
Absolutely. Just a quick shout out. If anybody has any questions, I saw Marco here. He enjoys the sessions and your tips. So thank you for that, Joël. But if anybody has any questions to Joël, feel free to leave them in the comments and we can address them at the end. Before we do so, I also want to ask you about the future. So where do you see is growth hacking heading to, or changing also throughout the next decade, probably? Maybe that's a bit too long, but where are we headed to in terms of growth hacking?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we perceive growth hacking really just as knowledge and tools and frameworks available on how to work and how to grow faster, how to scale a company, right? Then the change is definitely that this knowledge, which is very limited and was all created from Silicon Valley, right? Where it is by now definitely something many people have heard of or are aware of and also applying, moving over more also now to Europe, and it becomes more from something that is special to something which should become a commodity. People should be more aware of this, and actually becomes more the natural way on how we work, right? So this is actually what's happening. This is also what we do with our company, supporting this movement, right? Because at the end, you want to do what works, and that stuff works, and it impacts the way we work. And of course, you don't want to build old silo organizations anymore with marketing, product, sales. You want to be cross-functional teams, build teams that own KPIs, that have the authority and the responsibility to impact them. And if this is given, then growth hacking, it's natural. When you as a team, you're owning a KPI, it's natural that you need to start experimenting on how to improve this, right? Because you need to find it out.
Yeah.
So it's a natural thing that will come more and more, but that's definitely one thing that happens. Now, I mean, in terms of tactics and things you apply outside of the frameworks and defining on how it works, I mean, yeah, there's certain movement, increasing privacy, right? And that impacts tracking, less information, which is, of course, a pain. So then there, people have get more creative again on how they can capture data or how they can interpret the data is left behind. So that's definitely a challenge for anyone out there doing this currently.
It's like an ongoing cat and mouse game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's certain tool, I can tell you stories even about certain tools, let's say in the entire outbound sales area. It's always like, okay, LinkedIn tries to build this to stop a scraper or a bot, and then the other built this so it works again. It's like always going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts or tips and recommendations that you want to share with the audience today before we move over to the rapid fire questions that I prepared for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, final recommendations. If you're into that, if you want to scale your company, right? First things to start: measure. Try to build your pirate funnel. If you need support, reach out. We actually host our own growth community. So if you go on realgrowthhacking.com, you look for community, you can sign up there for free. It's a Slack channel with over 350 people. Ask questions to us, to the community. We're super happy to help you in building that and launching experiments. So that's a good way to get started. And then just get going, right? Align the team, measure, set the OKRs, and then start launching experiences and experiments.
Get in the game of growth hacking.
Yes.
That's the first most important step. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Joël, for the wrap up of today's session, I have some rapid fire questions for you. So I either give you different options to choose from or a simple question, and you have to answer in one sentence. You ready?
One sentence. Okay.
Exactly.
Let's go.
Product, sales, or growth hacking?
The combination of all of them.
I thought that's going to be your answer. What's your favorite place to live and work? Because I know you travel a lot.
Winter, snowboarding in the Graubünden, spring, kitesurfing in Elguna, summer, Zurich, Switzerland, autumn, Cape Town.
That's quite a nice combination. It's like growth hacking, right? The best combination of all the departments.
Trying.
Customer interview or customer data?
Both.
Yeah. And if you had to choose, would you prefer to have one experiment, but a fast one, or many different experiments at the same time?
One quick one, and then move to the next.
Great. Now a bit more personal questions. What does money mean to you?
Freedom and the ability to create impact.
Great. And the last one, where do you actually go to think?
Well, sadly, every time I try to sleep, the thinking starts, and then I need to get up again and write everything down so I can actually sleep.
So it's in bed when you think. That's great. Yeah. But
well, it's not great for sleeping, though, I can tell you.
I can imagine. Hey, Joël, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun. Thank you for coming on the show, and all the best, lots of success. And I'm sure that we will hear more from you in realgrowthhacking.com.
Cool. Thank you very much, Silvan. Thanks for having me. It was very fun.